Welcome to the Arts Lunch at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. I'm Jennifer Oz Freeman. I'm the Associate Professor and Program Director of Theology and Arts at United. I'm very excited to have Mimi Goodwin with us today. Mimi is a longtime friend of United, alum, not alum, almost alum, honorary alum. You feel like an alum.
You wish you were. We can fix that.
Incredible textile artist here in the Twin Cities. And I will let you introduce yourself even more, and we'll get to know you through your work today.
All right.
So welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad that all of you are here. And for myself, as someone who first heard about justice and racism as someone in a youth group in a church in Hollis, New Hampshire, when Reverend Philip Mitchell preached to this all-white town, he needed to go south. It was not optional. And he was one of the people, 27 white clergymen at that time, who went to march with Martin Luther King. And along the way in seminary, I was able to find him and thank him for planting that seed. So, and then fast forward, I've always sewn from when my mom and her sister, Auntie Sis, would drop scraps under the table, and I'd be hand sewing things for my dolls. And in the last few years, the passion and responsibility as someone who follows Christ to be about doing justice, working with fabrics, has really centered into a sense of call, and the naming of it is Justice Story Quilts. So I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm grateful for the seeds around both being a person of faith doing justice and the arts that I've experienced within the United Theological Seminary community. And I began seminary studies there and then transferred to Wesley in Washington, D.C., where my M.Div is from, and they also have a strong program in the arts. So here we are. And I want to begin, especially, well, anytime, any place, but especially if we're talking about justice, to remember that at least where we in person are, and then the people on Zoom, I invite you to pause too in terms of acknowledging the land that we are on. And here in Minnesota, we're on Dakota land, where generations of Dakota people have lived. And today, in this time of truth-telling, there is still so much truth-telling and reconciliation and reparation work ahead. I currently, in addition to doing the arts, I was feeling like I was semi-retired from church and community organization work and focusing on the arts. And then last summer, Marlene Helgemo, who is the pastor of All Nations Indian Church and the director of CAIM, passed away. So I have been coordinating at All Nations Indian Church since last summer, and also am the administrative assistant for CAIM, the United Church of Christ Council on American Indian Ministries. And so having this be a location of ministry also just keeps the generational impact of the legacy of oppression and racism in this land that is renamed America just so forefront in my heart. So again, welcome everyone, and here we are. Oh, the title gets goofy. Okay, well, the picture stays the same. Oh, no, it doesn't. Okay. We are the story. A visual response to racism. Answering this call as an artist really transformed who and how I am as an artist. Carolyn Mazlumi is the curator of this show, and it was the Textile Center here in the Twin Cities and the Women of Color Quilt Network who created this show as a visual response to racism after the murder of George Floyd. And I want to read a little bit about what Carolyn says about quilting and justice work. Why use quilts to tell this story of issues of race in America? Because quilting is one of America's most powerful art forms. with its widespread appeal and its association with comfort, warmth, and healing. Quilts and quilt making are especially important to African American culture because the art form was historically one of the few mediums accessible to marginalized groups to tell their own story, to provide warmth for their families, and to empower them with a voice. So you can pick up the first quilt. So at the time this call went out, it was in the end of April, and it was a quick turnaround. And I'm sitting in my studio, which at that point is completely empty because there had been a fire in the building I live in, which is not good for a fabric artist. And I knew I wanted to be a part of this show. So of course, people opened their fabric stashes to me, and this is what became created. The title is We Rise Up, Over and Around All Fences. And when that title kept coming, it was like so long, that's half of the artist statements for some galleries. And then during the trial of Chauvin, all of those fences that were erected, I knew that was the right title. This is a piece that is a community art making piece. This is in the midst of the pandemic. So everywhere I went, which wasn't so many places, I had a box with the fabric and the markers so people could add their own protest signs to it. And what has become a signature to the quilts since this quilt is the skies. So it's a day sky into a night sky, because both the oppression and the rising up is 24/7. So then maybe walk a little closer so people could actually see the signs. So this is the Lafayette Park fence in Washington, D.C. The absurdity of blocking off the public square. And you can go across. And it became a gallery of the protest signs. This red one is the youngest person, who was 3 years old at the time, and up to people who are in their 80s. And I asked her, is there a story, Amalia? And she goes, yes, it's just not fair. All right, then this slogan here, it says, if you're white, it's not called murder. And that slogan was originally in San Francisco with Dan White and the assassinations and the murder, both the mayor and the first gay elected official. And that came to life again in this quilt. Now the sidewalk, so lift it up just a little bit higher. So one of the things I love to do is quilt patterns that have been used for a long time. So when you scatter pieces, all sorts of shapes and sizes together like this green, it's called crazy quilting. So most of the Justice quilts have some crazy quilting in it because it's just crazy, just crazy. Now the sidewalk, and this is a story of how, as an artist, as much as I bring to the studio, there's other voices to listen to. So I remembered there was a block and it was called Courthouse Steps. And I was almost sure how to make it. And so it's a square in the middle, and the courthouse, it's even size strips go around. So Google is a part of my studio, and up pops crooked courthouse steps. Now I totally forgotten all about that block. And that's when you do different widths of fabric around the center square. So that, I don't need to say anything more about how that is part of this quilt. And then for me, this was prison bars. And when I was at another workshop, someone said, whoa, you even put the sidewalk grates on it. Oh. And again, the person creating and experiencing and looking at the art also brings and changes and shifts the art. one other. So hold it a little closer, let's see. So there's a Sankofa bird here. And this bird literally hopped all around this quilt. And where I first pictured it was up on top of the fence. But I found it blocked the kind of flow of the sky. And then one morning I walked in, it had fallen off the design board. It was kind of leaning against the sidewalk. I kid you not. And I realized, of course, the Sankofa bird is walking with us in the street. And the teaching from Ghana is in order to move forward, we always need to remember and know our stories. And the egg is about moving forward with the future generations. And part of justice is that people are seen. So this is the signature quilt of the different people who helped create this piece. Okay, well, my friend Don is getting the second piece. Recently, and maybe some of you were here, Ricardo Levins Morales was here at the seminary. And he handed out a little booklet called Tending the Soil. And when I was looking through this to prepare for today, this part leaped out. And one of the principles of organizing is organizing with kindling. And that's a reminder, you start with the small pieces. And that now is the image I have for this artwork. And as I listened to the news and when I was in seminary in Washington, D.C., I began a practice of praying through the news. And I have no intention of making a sketch. And lo and behold, inspiration will come. And that little sketch is a kindling. All of the materials, the beads, the fabric, the thread, the scraps of fabric, the bags of fabric that people say, here. And I have no idea what they're going to become. Those are the kindling. And I also deeply believe that each and every person, as we begin to, and it's ongoing, there's always more to learn. There's always more ways to continue to show up in this doing justice. And all of that is sparks along the way. One of my other passions, and it was when United Theological Seminary used to do the spirituality and the arts week in the summer times, is where I first connected, well, maybe it was at the Textile Center, with Saori weaving. So both it was at the Textile Center, I think it was my first class, but Jackie O'Brien also came to the seminary. And so this morning I put on this weaving, and part of justice comes, and this came from a workshop back in the 70s. The facilitator asked us, what does justice look like at 5 o'clock next Wednesday? And in the room, there were teenagers on up to, and I would think I was like, I was in my 30s then, on up to people who I thought were very, very old. Probably they were in their 60s, younger than me now.
Oh.
A Native American teenager named Michelle said, what justice looks like at 5 o'clock on next Wednesday is I have felt joy in my life uninterrupted for 24 hours. So when I'm creating pieces of joy and beauty, I remember Michelle. So this piece is from Saori weaving, and part of the principle of Saori weaving is you come to the loom. You don't come with a sketch. You don't come with a theme. You start weaving. And so probably it was 2 years after I wove this. And when I knew it was waterish and sand, it became Changing Tides and became one of the pieces around environmental justice. And in this justice work, we need to do the research. We need to know the information. And in terms of environmental justice, being able to portray and celebrate the incredible beauty of creation and the wisdom that creation holds. And the top piece, I asked a friend of mine, do you have to have any driftwood? About, I held up my hands this long. She goes, oh, just a minute. She dug in her car and there it was. So I get creating with sport. Okay. During the COVID pandemic, this activist was so restless. I'm also a cancer survivor, so I needed to be very, very careful. And early on, a friend of mine who's also an artist posted on Facebook going, no, we're not sheltering at home. We have a looking like a long time artist in residency at our home address. And that changed my whole attitude of the pandemic. And particularly the first piece that I showed, creating that piece and participating in the show helped me feel connected to everything that was happening in the streets when it would have been too risky for me to be there. So creating continues along the way. So for the next piece, I'm going to have my friend Dawn just show the piece. And then both people here in the room and on Zoom, I want you to call out what you would name this piece.
Let's say sea dreams.
So one naming was Sea Dreams. And is that SEA? Okay. Yeah.
Streams of grace.
Streams of grace.
I would call it rapture.
Rapture. I know when I'm a participant on Zoom, it can be sometimes hard to know just when. So what I'll do is I'll call out the names of the people on Zoom and invite you if you want to lift up a title too. So Melissa, would you like to call out a title?
I also felt that word streams coming out, but since she took it, I think flowing water. It's very, there's just so much texture and movement and flow.
Yeah.
And then Tara, it's wonderful to see you again, Tara.
Colors show up so differently online.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to point out features or do you want me to get closer?
I think it's kind of hard to tell how texture.
Oh, there we go.
Oh,
To see how texture it is.
Yeah, crystals.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. So maybe Tara stepped away. Shock.
I came in late, so I didn't hear an intro. So I think I'm just looking at it and giving a title out of context. It looks like a forest in winter. So I would say wintry forest.
Let's see, okay. Derek, I have to get my bifocals lined up with the names. So Derek, good morning.
I was thinking of the Night River.
Night River.
Night River.
Ooh. Yes. All right. What do you see? I call it grandma.
Then Eileen. Okay, or Tara, I'm glad to see you again, yay. Would you like to add a title to our big piece here?
She's on.
You're on mute.
Not a good idea to try to drive and operate my phone at the same time. It sort of reminds me of the tree of life. It sort of reminds me of dreadlocks, which have a lot of life and energy. And it also reminds me of, I just read this book. And I'm not going to remember the name of it, so it's not going to sound good, but it was about enslaved people escaping and things that people would leave on the trees to kind of like direct them in a certain way. It reminds me of that.
Anyone else, either on Zoom or in the room, want to call out a title?
I'm gonna say origins.
Origins.
I think heartbeat of a river, I'm just really drawn to that heart.
So yeah, there's one
There's a little one above it too.
large and then smaller heartbeats.
An exercise.
Thank you. I love lifting that exercise up. And for me, it's such a reminder that art is so much more than these hands create. And there's truth in all that was just shared with what people are experiencing and seeing in this particular piece. And so all that was lifted up was just as real and just as important as what I'm now going to say in terms of as I was sewing and creating this piece in the midst of the pandemic. And it began as a piece honoring the people who had died directly from COVID. And of course, during COVID, the discrepancy in our healthcare system were screaming. And how do I translate this into fabric? And all of the places where not only was there such a depth of loss, but the containers, our spiritual and our religious and our cultural containers that hold us while we're grieving, were also not available to us. And that is what I kept wrestling with for day after day. And that is the piece that came. And so the titling that I gave this piece was a COVID Requiem. And this celebrates how we navigate losses during pandemic times. COVID-19 impacts how we live, learn, love, and lament. Ways of welcoming newborn babies are altered. One of the moments in the pandemic is a friend of mine picked up a basket, and it was a baby shower curbside pickup for a family whose child was about to be born. How people breathe their last breaths is changed. Celebrations of life are curtailed or put on hold, or they become virtual services that replace the in-person traditions of comfort, faith, and community. In a time such as this, our spiritual practices continue to carry us through these stormy waters. Okay, the next, well, maybe I'll just pause, and are there any questions that people want to lift up at this point?
I'd like to hear a question, or have a question about process, because you had mentioned with the first image that you shared, you know, that the bird had fallen off.
Right.
So what's your process like in general, or for about, or maybe in regards to specific pieces, you know, in terms of like how you lay them out and kind of create the composition with layering?
I'm smiling because you can't see it yet, but there's a piece that is in process that is next, actually. So
Perfect.
plan that. So, if there's any other questions? It's all process. Process. Perfect. Okay, then why don't we
Sure.
bring it on over? So when I first moved into where I live now, there was a giveaway table. And so about 7 or 8 years ago, there was 6 really large bulletin boards. And I said, okay, I'm going to bring you upstairs. I don't know what you're going to become. They have become the design boards for the Justice quilts, because the texture and the weight of the fabrics, oftentimes regular design boards just won't hold them. Plus, my studio isn't large enough to have a whole wall for designing. So this is part of the process, is these bulletin boards. So this quilt began when there was all the movement to stop line 3. So part of the process is, again, this sky. And I was so aware when I was making this particular sky that it was wider than some others. And as I kept looking at it, and before I sew it, I pin the fabric up here. So I get that sense of flow, especially in the sky. And I took some of these off, and it just didn't seem right. Months later, I was aware of having the sky be bigger was about creation. As much as we're experiencing a specific place of creation, if we're looking this way, we can take a deeper breath and see more and more of creation. So again, some of this process is about listening to the piece itself, having a voice. Let's go over here. So in terms of the researching, the tar sands up in Alberta, Canada. So this is this piece. And the forest that was there is absolutely gone. And again, Googling, finding pictures of the tar sands. And then one of the challenges with the fabric is how literal, I'll move so you can see a little bit, how literal to recreate. So this tar sands went through, especially all this, the metallic of the buildings and the pipes and the stacks. And it went through a lot of variations. And it began to just feel too busy. And it was more about the devastation. And again, you'll see the crazy quilting and the oil. So a lot of the process is, how do I translate, whether it's this issue, this photograph, how do I translate that with fabric? And then having a fabric stash is just so much fun, and having it be visible. So a lot of times I'm just pulling things out. So for example, this batik, you can move in closer so they can see. I mean, it has trees and animals in it. This is the last bit of that batik. I've had it for years. And so it's like a dance with whatever the justice story is, the materials, and it's like a language. You know, how do we translate it in? And again, the longer I was creating this, the more it kept landing in creation, not so much with the destruction. And then, so then this, again, this is the crooked courthouse steps turned into a tube for the pipeline with dollar signs on it. And the numerous times this line 3 crosses the sacred waters in Minnesota is just astounding. And of course, how many leaks have already happened? And come on over here. So then one of the big questions is, how do you create the wild rice lakes with fabric? Tucked away in a bag that was given to me was this scrap of fabric. And I remembered it. So here I am digging through the bags, trying to find it. And then in terms of the drought that was going on, this was a friend of mine said, because I was like, I don't know how to make the drought. And so she pulled this just perfect fabric out. So that's the process in terms of with the fabric. And then on the bulletin boards, I put all sorts of notes. So this is a list of possible ways of how to quilt the piece. This piece I also see becoming like the first piece in terms of in community, the protest signs. So the research has included saving those pictures. So there'll be, the signs will be scattered about in it, is what I think. We'll see.
What's this part here?
So
More crazy quiltness.
yeah, more crazy quiltness. So let's see, maybe let's start up here. So this was a panel, again, that was gifted in one of the bags of fabric that is just incredible. This is actually the back side of the fabric. It's even brighter green in the print. And it just like stopped the motion. It was so bright. But the beauty of it. And then I remembered one of my teachers years ago, always look at the other side of the fabric. And so then this had the vitality of creation, but it wasn't just pulling your eyes away from the rest of the quilt. So this is the back, and for this being the headwaters. And so again, this brighter, crazy quilting, for me at this point, it's about celebrating creation and even what looks intact in creation is being intact. So at this point, that's what that is. And this water, the COVID requiem is strips of blues that are collaged together. This river is one batik piece that has been folded and twisted around for the texture. And then you want to pull up the one that's the sure would be what's next.
And we end at 1:15. So
Oh,
if we could have,
1:15,
yeah,
we got time. Okay.
time, and then hopefully end with some Q&A.
This week, as we're all aware, is the year anniversary of the war in Ukraine. Within a couple weeks of that invasion, of course, it's like, how can this, that is so important and so large on so many levels, how could that possibly become a quilt? And lately, inspiration is not a problem for me. I literally have a large sketch pad of Justice quilts. So this quilt I began making about 2 weeks after the war began. It is currently over at the Benedictine Center in Saint Paul, which this time of the year, they do an exhibition called Seeing God. And the Changing Tides piece and the We Rise Up Over Fences have been in the show in the past. When you're an artist entering things, you need to remember to read the details. So, and this is a story about Mimi's plan changed, and this piece is much more powerful than it would have been. So in the past, it's been 6 feet, has been the maximum in this show. It's 5 feet this year. So on the left are blocks telling stories about resistance. In the intention and the design originally, there's another whole series that would have been on the right side of the quilt. And I went, ooh. It will be too big. And what came from that, as soon as I saw them hang it up on the wall, it's a very different piece. If the resistance and that strength had kind of bookended the destruction, it would have been a very different piece. And especially in a place of English where our gut is to read from left to right, to have it be this unfinishedness. That was not my design. Totally changed the piece. Let me see, I'll read what I wrote. Ukraine is on fire is the title. And then from Isaiah, they will beat swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not lift up swords against nation, neither will they learn war anymore. In Ukraine, the fire of resistance and resilience burns bright. Homelands are defended with determination and dedication. Tractors become tow trucks. Neighbors weave camouflage nets in galleries emptied of art. International Women's Day bouquets are given. Subway stations offer shelter and community. War's devastating destruction burns cities, towns, power plants, and farms. God's presence is clear in each act of resistance and resilience. God's creativity is embodied by artists creating pieces holding these stories. So as you look at the piece on the left are the stories of resistance. And so the top is the flag. And originally, and again, this is the fabric having a voice and a vote. I chose those fabrics for the colors. And it wasn't until I was quilting that piece that I realized in the yellow, there are stars, and in the blue, there's flowers. And so this war is turning things upside down. And the flag, the golden and the yellow is about all the grain and the land and the sky. And it wasn't until I was quilting that I realized those details were in this fabric. And then the large sunflower, again, it was in one of the bags of fabric. It was really kind of a Americana, all sorts of barns and all that. And I was like, what am I ever going to do with that? And there was this large piece of fabric. And I thought, I need to see what sunflowers I have. And partway along, I remembered that fabric. So that's where that sunflower came from. And I was totally baffled and amazed. Where do you get bouquets of flowers in a war zone? Last International Women's Day, and I'm anticipating very soon, especially the women soldiers were given bouquets of flowers. So that's what's under the sunflower. It still baffles me, like, where in the war zone did all these bouquets come from? So out on the battlefield, in the cities, all these people were giving the wounded soldiers flowers. The next image, I'm sure you know, in terms of the tractors becoming tow trucks. This was one of those clear images that I wrestled with. How do you make that out of fabric? Well, in one of those bags, and I almost threw this away, was a piece of fabric, probably 2 feet by 2 feet, of race cars. When was I ever gonna sew race cars, right? And then there was, it's called a jelly roll, when it's pre-cut strips of fabric about 2.5 inches wide, and then they just roll it up and they sell it to you. And so I had one of those that was all batiks. So I remembered what became the tank was in one of those rolls. And then all the rest of the vehicle parts used to be race cars. So the actual, on the tank, that's a bumper. And one of the things I think about being artist, and I believe in my first work especially was teaching with little kids. And that creativity in that art center, I never saw a kid go, oh, I can't be an artist, I'm not going in that place. They all went to that place. And I encourage that belief that all of us, we're created in our Creator's image. So that means we are creative people. And whether or not you ever do any quote unquote art making, looking at the world with these creating eyes and hearts and spirit, like these race cars being transformed, that can strengthen any movement to justice. And during the pandemic, I was going on all sorts of Zooms because I was just so missing community. And it was one of the talks that Pacific School of Religion gave. And it was about writing our stories. And they talked about anyone who's ever been in the street doing justice, you're a fiction writer. Because what we're marching for, we have glimpses of. So walking in the world with those eyes and awarenesses of transformation is a gift that everyone can walk with as we're doing justice. And then as artists, we are even more intentional in bringing that into the world. So on the bottom left is another whole story of transformation. So this is one of the camouflage nets, and literally in the galleries, the artwork was packed away and put in what was going to be the safest place so that the artwork would be maintained. Many of these galleries became factories of weaving the camouflage nets and also welding the blockades to stop the tanks in the streets. So again, this gallery, the purpose totally changed. And again, I'm a weaver, so I'm like, okay, how do I weave this net? And again, I wanted it to be a little bit of a 3D. And this is where people who are not artists go, you have too much stuff, Mimi. People who are artists go, no, she doesn't. Anyway, my auntie sis, who I mentioned at the beginning, sewing on the floor, after she passed away and I was closing down her home, and I hadn't realized she had a lot of fabulous hats. And so I just packed all the hats together, including, and this wasn't attached to any hat, it was really stiff, this kind of deep green veil. So here I am looking at pictures on my phone of these different weaving places for these nets. And I remember that veil. So in I go, I pull down the box of hats, and sure enough, that's there. So that's the base underneath it, and then I could bend it around a little bit so it had more texture. And I like that it goes off of oftentimes these quilts are not symmetrical even squares. Which, when I first started doing this, it was like, oh. You know, and Deidre Shearer is a textile artist that was here at United, and she taught the edge to edge that those crazy quilts are. I literally could not do it in her workshop. I could not do edge to edge. It was like I was hyperventilating because it went against all the teachings I had about quilting and lining all those edges up. By afternoon, I started doing it and haven't stopped since. So from the moment this quilt was placed on the wall at the Benedictine Center, and that show continues until the 23rd of March, people gathered around this quilt. And it was a teaching to me about part of our responsibility as artists is creating pieces that create a place of conversation. So here we are. And one of the women said, "Did you cry while you were making this quilt?" And I said, "I did." And the brown is the mass graves, and I just sobbed, and I just like, how do we create that? And how could there possibly be this piece without the mass graves? And the other time, the gray crazy quilting, and within the grays and in the gold by the tractor, there's musical notes. Because again, the music is part of what is uplifting the people in Ukraine. It is also a part of our justice work and our faith and our cultures. So there's music scattered throughout. And I kept trying to put red fabric in for the blood, and it just wasn't right. It, even when the fabric was cut, swirling, it was too solid. And one of the things about using the edge to edge, just stitch over it if you don't like it. So I stitched over all that. And then this might be something that I want to do more. I have worked very little really with fabric paints, but I remembered I had fabric paints. So again, this is, at that point, the sky is done. Some of the other blocks are done. And the gray was up on one of these bulletin boards. I took it off, put plastic down on my kitchen floor, diluted some of the red fabric paint, and then splattered it. And that was another time of the lamenting. Yeah. The huddle of people. Again, this is a piece of fabric that my first reaction, the faces just really, I did not connect with. And I didn't throw it away though. So I cut it apart to collage into this subway gathering, and there's also cats and dogs collaged in there. What else to say? Okay, the AETN, some of you may remember that is Russian for children. So that is the building that was the theater where people were in shelter. That was then bombed, and they had painted on the parking lot that there were children here. And this was another process of how literal to be, so it was recognizable. And one friend who looked at it said, "You could have been an architect," because I got into that, the details on the folding it for the different features on the building. And there was a photo of the morning afterwards for the sun. And this sun is made from fabric of sunflowers. So then another challenge, how do you make fire? And so I had a pile of orange fabric, and then a box came from Ohio, from my friend who was giving me fabric. And so I dumped it in the living room floor. So all of this fire, it's one piece of fabric that was in that box. with various shades. So I tore it and stripped it and then bent it and stitched it into the fire. I also am humbled and honored that this piece was awarded the first place prize for Seeing God. And so, wow, yeah. And the judges, actually, one of the judges gave me his notes because I thought, ooh, that needs to be in my artist statement. He really saw and talked about as artists, part of our job is to wrestle with the difficult issues. And the monastery, there are still some sisters that are there. And one of the sisters who, I don't know what she's like about this tall, she just kind of snuck up and gave me a hug and with tears in her eyes, said, I've always loved that passage from Isaiah, but will it ever come true? And then we talked about the different ways, because she had more decades than me. I was showing up, working for justice, and in a way, justice peace is one word. It will never come without each other.
Would you mind reading the Isaiah passage?
Oh, sure. So from Isaiah chapter 2, they will beat swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not lift up sword against nation, neither will they learn war anymore.
Yes. Maybe have time for one or two questions before you. So, stop sharing.
Yeah. So are there any questions or stories that people want to share at this point?
I'll ask another process question, since you mentioned having a sketchbook full of ideas. How do you pick which projects to work on from all those ideas, and how many do you work on multiple projects at the same time, or what's that process?
So I've never been someone, even back when I was sewing my own clothes, okay, I'm gonna make this pair of pants. I've always had multiple different projects going, so that's true with these. And also, after I finished the Ukraine is on a Fire quilt, I made some table runners that actually are about spring flowers, balancing it out, because when you step into and you hold with our hearts and with our whole being as artists, or everyone, as we're living in these times, we also need to sustain us. So that's been part of the process, is to pace it. And actually the line 3 quilt, I folded up when line 3 went through. And this is the first time I've opened it up for a long time. So this time you pick it up and you set it aside. In terms of the process, there are some, like as soon as the war started, intentionally I felt drawn that there was going to be a piece to make. Other times, that's not how it goes. So for example, there's a quilt pattern called Sunshine and Shadow. And how it works is it's squares of fabric. So I started making one of these, hand sewing it, because I find hand sewing to be peaceful, I used to think it was boring and way too slow and no thank you very much. So I started this quilt, Sunshine and Shadow, of red, black, and white fabrics. And that's what it was gonna be until a couple weeks ago. Well, so here we go. I'm just drawing it so you get a sense of the pattern. So you start with this center square, and then you use the same fabric and go around and around. So as it gets bigger, there's these like diamonds going around. And so it's light and dark. So one of the naming is Sunshine and Shadow. And then since it's the diamonds, one of the other namings is Trip Around the World. So every February on Valentine's Day across country around the world, but US and Canada, there's gatherings and marches and protests honoring the missing and murdered Indigenous women and other relatives and Two-Spirit people. And the red dresses are part of what has become an expression of this loss. So a couple weeks before this march is happening, I decided to sew on this quilt. Well, so this quilt is now going to turn into a justice quilt. And the sunshine and shadow, you know, picturing the women and the other relatives, whenever they were abducted day or night, and the trip around the world and the trafficking. And so this will be in the center of the quilt. And then around it will be blocks, some of which will have the red dresses of different sizes and different clothes. And then also the signs, like the protest signs and the statistics. And these quilts are also teaching quilts. So I just thought it was a red, white, and black quilt. And then there's two quilts that are in process in terms of the inspiration, the sketching, and I love the gathering part of being an artist. So there was an ad for an ocean conservancy group, and the headline was the amount of tons of plastic that go into the ocean. I can't remember if it's every day, every month, every year, that number. So I tore that out, put it in the sketchbook. And as someone who is aware, I'm just astounded at how much plastic has come into my house and into our church. And so I have totes now that are overflowing with plastic. And so that will be woven with fabric and plastic. And the totes are overflowing on that's one of my standards. It's time to create when the totes are overflowing. And then there's a series that this spring it will be 5 years since I was diagnosed with cancer. And so there's been sketches along the way, and it feels like now there's enough distance that I can begin. That's going to be a series. And the title, which I love, of the series is Don't Paint With Me. And there was just, as a feminist, all the pastel pink and all these brochures. Oh, yeah. Anyway. But again, those totes are overflowing. And I've never liked pink, even as a little kid. So much of the pink has come from fabric stashes of other people. And now those totes are overflowing. So that's one of the clues that it's time to start sewing, is when the totes are overflowing.
Yeah, I missed some of the beginning, but I guess my curiosities are around, like, who are your ancestors, and like was weaving part of your anything that you know about who your ancestors were. / other question is, like, you know, sometimes Jennifer talks about, like, go like paint the thing or do the thing, draw the thing that this issue that you're thinking about, and it will help you to sort of understand that better. And I'm just thinking about the ways that, like, literal weaving is teaching you about theological things, like weaving, you know, the sort of interconnectedness, and so either of those things.
Yeah. Whenever I say where I am from, it's all colonization. So I was born in Hollis, New Hampshire, in New England, and on my dad's side, I am descended from William Bradford. And so one of the pieces that is sketched out. So he arrived on the East Coast land of the Abenaki people and the Pequot people in 1620. In 1637, he was very key in the massacre of the Pequot people. And so what has come for that fact in my ancestry is a piece that will print on fabric the way he's uplifted as this hero, but cut apart with the truth of that time. On my mom's side, it's the Huguenot people. And the Huguenot people are weavers. And the first time I sat at the Sayuri room, and the teacher was a man, I really felt my ancestors' presence and the weaving. And my mom gave me, and there's 2 weavings that are about the same size as this paper, and they're blue and white weavings. And so I was given them back in the 80s. And in the 90s, and it was at United, it was a class on feminist studies, and we needed to, our final project needed to be talking about our own, the women in our own families. And a woman was sharing, and she also has Huguenot people. So people have asked me to carbon date these weavings, but I haven't done that. But what she shared was a tradition. When someone from the family was leaving to come to America. So the Huguenot people moved from France to Holland to England to America in terms of seeking religious freedom for themselves as Christians, forgetting that freedom for just me and just my people isn't what it's about. And the story she told is that when someone is going to be leaving, the family members that were in the factories would pull off some of the weaving, sneak it home, cut it in small pieces. So the people leaving would travel with that and always remember who they were. So, and before that, I had this open house at my house, and I didn't know these were that old. And all my mom said is her mom gave them to her, and her grandma gave it to her mom. That's all I knew about this weaving. But there was a gentleman who said, those are Huguenot weavings. Take those thumbtacks out of the wall. So, that is the story I now say about those weavings. And sometimes I bring them into workshops like this. So that's a little, thank you, in terms of who I am and yeah.
We're at time, but thank you so much for sharing your work with us and the process and everything. It's lovely to have you here, and thankful for your work.
Thank you. It's astounding.
And thank you too.